Our last part of Chapter 1 is anatomical terminology. You saw a lot of this in Lab 2. We'll go through it again to clarify it. The types of terms include terms for relative position. These describe where a part is in relation to another part. Sections, usually we mean section to mean a portion of something, but sect actually comes from a word for cut. So a section in this context is a way to cut the body or an organ to look inside it. And then the regions are the terms that are for specific areas of the body. Now, why do we need special terms?
To identify the part or the problem.
Yeah, to identify parts, to talk about problems. Imagine if your doctors were saying something like this. Having a specific vocabulary makes it clearer when medical professionals communicate with each other. The terms for relative position are standard ways to describe the locations of body parts. So you can use these in learning those parts, describing where organs are in relation to each other. They're also used in surgery and locating wounds. Like we might say, a gunshot wound was, lateral to this, superior to that, to describe exactly where it is. Most of these terms are pairs of opposites, so things like up and down, left and right, front and back. And they are based on Latin, so we have words derived from all of these. Some of these are going to be words you use every day, but in usually a more idiomatic or figurative sense, where here they're going to be literal. Now, to use the terms correctly, you need to know the anatomical position. So, anatomical position is facing the viewer, everything's straight, standing upright. The one thing that's weird is the palms face forward. That's useful because you've got two bones in your forearm that when the palms are forward, they run parallel. When you're just relaxed with your palms facing your body, they cross each other. So it's not as easy to see things clearly. The way we use these relative terms if you use it in a sentence, the format is part A is blank to part B. What that means is if you're starting at part B, which way do you go to get to part A? If you have to go up, that part is superior. If you go down, that part is inferior. So you could say the shoulders are superior to the hips. So we often use these figuratively if something is better quality or if somebody is your boss, they're called superior. But here it's literally up and down. Anterior and posterior are the terms for front and back. So you could say something like the sternum or breastbone is anterior to the spinal column. One that was in the lab was the larynx is anterior to the esophagus. And you might have had to flip through a couple of pages of diagrams to get a good look at those and where they are in relation to each other. But now you'll know. Ventral and dorsal are sometimes used interchangeably with anterior and posterior. What they mean is belly and back. So the belly or ventral would be the same as anterior. Dorsal would be the same as posterior. In humans, it works that way. Now suppose something was walking on four legs. Now which way is ventral? The belly is down, so it's
and dorsal.
Ventral and dorsal are always going to be opposites, but how they tie in with these other two pairs is what varies.
Superior and inferior.
Inferior, yeah. So if something has a horizontal posture, dorsal is superior, ventral is inferior. Where for us, dorsal is posterior, ventral is anterior. Think about fish with a dorsal fin, or whales. Most of the time, we use this for general stuff that's cross species, like the cavities. We still use it sometimes in the nervous system and in embryology, studying development. For the sides, left and right are the left and right of the body you're looking at. Okay. So which hand is this? It's my left hand. So even though as you're looking at me, it's on the right, you would call it the left. Now, we don't usually use these in this format, say something is to the left of something else. We would use it just to describe a part, like the spleen is on the left, the liver's on the right. You would talk about your left and right arm, left and right kidney, and so on. Describing things relatively, we're going to use medial and lateral more. Medial means something is closer to the center. Lateral means it's out to the sides. Okay. It sounds kind of like the median of a highway. Lateral means sides. So you could say the nose is medial to the ears. Now, what the difference is, these arrows coming out are indicating his left and right. Which one's this?
Left.
Left. That's right. They're both pointing in a lateral direction. Okay. Now, why we need to distinguish, if you are coming from, say, the left lung, the heart's going to be to the right, but it's to the left of the right lung. But to both lungs, it's medial. Okay. So medial and lateral let us be more specific about where something is on the left or right, and to specify if something is close to the center. And this line they've drawn down the center of him, we call that the midline. So your nose is right on the midline, so is your sternum. Your heart's actually a little bit to the left, then the midline goes through it. Questions on sides? There's a couple additional terms we use related to sides. If we have two of something, we might say it's bilateral. Though usually we wouldn't say the lungs are bilateral to the heart, we just say the lungs are lateral to the heart. But we would say that we have bilateral lungs. So these usually aren't in that format. Ipsilateral means that two things are on the same side. So if I had ipsilateral burns on my arm and leg, they would both be on the same side. Contralateral tells you that two things are on the opposite side. Now, these two are sometimes used in this format. Like you could say the spleen is contralateral to the liver. On the limbs, we have a special set of terms that mean that something is closer to or further from the trunk. These terms are proximal and distal. So this is one where you haven't seen these words specifically, but you've seen similar words, or words with the same roots. Approximate, it means nearly, like when you estimate something, it's nearly that. So proximal means near or closer to the trunk. Distance, how far something is. So distal means far. So your elbow is proximal to your wrist. The knee is distal to the thigh. Now on the legs, you'll see proximal and distal used interchangeably with superior and inferior, but on the arms it's always proximal and distal. You'll also see these used sometimes for internal tubes where you have a starting point and whatever's closer to that is proximal. Like say, if you were looking at circulation and you started at the heart, the aorta, the first artery that comes out, is proximal to any other artery you could name. All right, questions on these? One more set for surface, superficial and deep. This is another place where you've probably used these figuratively. You know, somebody who's just worried about appearances is superficial. Something that really makes you think, like a poem, is deep. Okay. Here it's literal. Superficial means it's closer to the surface. So your skin would be your most superficial organ all the way around. And you would say that it's superficial to the muscles. When you've got things layered, you could say this muscle is deep to that muscle. That sounds kind of weird, but we really do use it that way. Now, why do you think we have a separate set of terms for this instead of being able to use the other ones in this case?
Because everything's not on the same level. Yes.
Yeah, things are going to be lined up differently. Okay, so this skin is, if we didn't use superficial and deep, which direction is this skin to everything inside my arm? Well, top would be up. So this one's anterior. How about this one? Is posterior. But they're both superficial. And actually, you've pointed out something else where we have to be more specific. If you say something's on top, we might mean that as it's above, so superior, or as closer to the surface, which is superficial. And that's why we need these specific terms, instead of just saying, well, this is on top of that. So this diagram puts them all together. This arrow going up would be superior, anterior, posterior. This one coming toward the midline. Only if it's on the limbs. Medial, okay, and then so that one would be lateral. This one coming up on the arm, proximal, and then going out towards the fingertips, distal. And you could use those same ones on the limbs. Okay. So those are the terms you want to use to describe where things are. The body sections, there are 3, because we're 3-dimensional, so you can use each of those 3 dimensions to get a different straight cut. 2 of them are vertical. That's sagittal, which splits the body into left and right sides. Sagittal is another word for to the sides. Now, it's a little weird and it might not work for you, but one of the ways I remember this one is I think of Sagittarius the archer and William Tell shooting the arrow straight at and cutting the apple in the same direction as a sagittal section. You can be more specific with sagittal. If it's directly down the center, you could call it mid-sagittal or median section. If it's a sagittal cut but it's off to one side, like say you wanted to include the eye in it, then you could say that it's parasagittal. Para is near or next to. The other vertical cut is frontal or coronal. You'll see both terms used. And there will be some other places where we use these terms where you have to use just the one. But for the section, you can use either. This splits the body into front and back. Coronal means crown, like you're coming straight through your crown to do it. Frontal, think of, you could split the sides apart and looking from the front, you'd still see the cut. Transverse, sometimes called a horizontal section. Transverse means across. So that cuts horizontally to split the body into top and bottom. Has anyone been to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago? I think they still have this. One of the stairways, they have a series of body slices. They have a whole set of sagittal going from one side to the other, a whole set of transverse from top to bottom, and a whole set of frontal sections going front to back. So you can see into the body in all kinds of different spots. It's pretty cool. So this diagram shows one of each section. So this one, the only horizontal one, would be transverse. They've cut through the abdomen, and you probably need to learn more before you can identify anything here, but I can see a vertebra and the liver. This one, where they've cut vertically down the front, that's frontal, and it cuts through the knee joints. A lot of things in a frontal section will be the same shape as they would be looking from the front as well. And then the other vertical one would be sagittal. Okay. With sagittal,